Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today I'll be taking you through a free response question from the 2015 AP Macroeconomics exam. I'll be breaking down the question and relating it to the current COVID-19 pandemic and the effect that that's had on the economy, as well as the impact it's had on monetary policy decisions, as well as fiscal policy initiatives and decisions from Congress. So we're going to go ahead and get into the question, and as I go through the questions, I'll relate it to COVID-19 to kind of give you a real-world example that can help you remember this better for the AP Macroeconomics exam. So let's go ahead and start with question 1. Assume the United States economy is operating below full employment. Well, if we're below full employment, that means we're in a recession, right? So this was like what happened in March when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and mass amounts of people were laid off, GDP plummeted, right? So we're below full employment. So we're going to go ahead and draw that in graph form to give you a better idea of what was going on. So we're going to have our price level, which will represent as PL on our y-axis. And then on our x-axis, we're going to have real GDP, right? So we got real GDP. All right, so now it asks us to go ahead and write the full employment output labeled as YF. So we're going to have YF, and that's going to be our full employment, right? And that's also going to be our long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, now we're going to have our short run aggregate supply curve going up. So we're going to have short run aggregate supply curve going up, and we're going to have our aggregate demand curve going down. So we've got aggregate demand. Now, as you can see, where our short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect, that's below our long run aggregate supply curve, right? That means our output is less than full employment. And that's where we were at in March and currently still are, right? Our output is still less than where we were at full employment. We have lots of unemployment still. We were in double digits back in March and April, right? And we're still in a recovery. So right here, this is our recessionary gap, that distance between Y1 and YF. That's called our recessionary gap. We see we're going to have a price level over on our y-axis of PL1. All right, well, if we look at part B, now we're going to talk about solutions, right? How did we fix this recession, or at least make attempts and start to move towards a better direction after this recession occurred? Well, we saw the Federal Reserve take action. So if you look at part B, we have assume the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Well, if we're targeting a new federal funds rate to reach full employment, that's called expansionary monetary policy, right? We're trying to expand the economy using monetary policy. So should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? Well, if they want to conduct expansionary monetary policy, they're going to lower that federal funds rate to increase that monetary supply, or that money supply. I misspoke there, right? They want to increase that money supply, right? And you'll see why in part C, right? Because given that Federal Reserve action we identified in part B of lowering that federal funds rate, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. All right, so we're going to have our nominal interest rate on our y-axis, right? Nominal interest rate, and we are going to have our quantity of money on our x-axis, right? So I'm going to put Q of money on our x-axis. All right, so now we're going to have our money demand. That's a downward sloping curve, right? So we got monetary demand. And we're going to have our initial money supply pre-monetary policy change, right? So pre-pandemic, our monetary supply will be MS1. Well, post-pandemic, what we did is we increased that monetary supply by lowering our federal funds rate and increasing the amount of money circulating in the economy, right? So we increased our monetary supply. So we increased our quantity of money from M1 over to M2. Now, when we did that, what we did is we lowered that nominal interest rate, right, from R1, where we were at pre-pandemic, to now post-pandemic, we are at R2, right? So we have a lower nominal interest rate. Now, why does this expand the economy? Well, when we have a lower nominal interest rate, we increase investment spending and consumer consumption, right? So our aggregate demand curve will shift then to the right, bringing us back to that full employment level where short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand all intersect at YF. All right, so if we look at part D, the policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than the monetary policy in part B, right? So this is going to be Congress that's pursuing this fiscal policy. Assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is $300 billion. If the government changes its spending without changing taxes, right, so that's telling us that we're going to be talking about the government spending multiplier and not the tax multiplier. To eliminate this recessionary gap, right, so we want it to equal that $300 billion, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. Well, the minimum required change in government spending is not that $300 billion, right, and I'll show you why here. So what we have this thing called the government spending multiplier. Well, the government spending multiplier is 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. We were told our marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, right? So 1 minus 0.8 gives us 0.2. So we have 1 over 0.2, which is 5. So 5 is our government spending multiplier. Well, when we take our government spending multiplier and we multiply it by the amount of money that we changed in our government spending, we need to get that 300 billion, right? So we can go ahead and write 300 billion, and this will be dollars, right? $300 billion has to equal that 5, our government spending multiplier, times X, right? X being that change in government spending. So we divide each side by 5, and we get 300 billion over 5 equals X, and that's going to be $60 billion, right? So our answer is going to be $60 billion, right? And that's all going to help expand that economy, right? Just like we did during the pandemic. We wanted to conduct fiscal policy that would expand and increase our aggregate demand to bring us back to full employment, right? So in this situation, if we were using these numbers, we would want to increase our government spending by $60 billion. Now, if we look at part 2, if the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required change in government spending in part D1? Well, it's going to have to be greater than, right? And here's why. That tax multiplier, which is what happens when we change taxes instead of government spending, our tax multiplier is going to be 1 less than our government spending multiplier. So our government spending multiplier was this 5 here. Our tax multiplier then will be 4. Now, if we did 300 billion over 4, that's $75 billion that the government has to change, right? So we know that it has to be greater. So we can go ahead and put greater than, right? In the explanation, I'm not going to write it all out because it's going to take a long time to write out, but I'll go ahead and give it to you verbally. So the required change in taxes will be greater than the required change in government spending calculated in part D1 because the tax multiplier is 1 less than the government spending multiplier, right? And that's all you would need to say for part 2 to part D. All right, so now we've got question E1. So we were told, assume the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap, right? And by lowering income taxes, they're going to boost aggregate demand because consumer spending and investment spending will increase. So that would also be one way that we could bring ourselves back to full employment. So now if we look at part 1, we have aggregate demand. Will it increase, decrease, or stay the same? Well, like I just said, aggregate demand, which I'm going to represent as AD, that's going to increase, right? And I'm going to use BC for because. Our aggregate demand will increase because T, taxes, when taxes decrease, right? When taxes go down, represented by that down arrow. When taxes decrease, consumer spending, CS, will increase, and investment spending will increase. So I'll call that I. Investment spending will increase as well. Both of those shift our aggregate demand back up to that full employment level. And then we have part 2, the long run aggregate supply. Well, our long run aggregate supply, if we were to lower taxes, that is going to create a greater incentive to work, and therefore our long run aggregate supply will increase, right? So our long run aggregate supply will increase because there is a greater incentive to work. You also could have said that the long run aggregate supply will increase because there will be an increase in savings. I'll do up for increase, right? There will be an increase in savings, which will be S. I'll call it savings S, or I'll just write it out, and an increase in investment, right? So investment in physical capital. And that investment in physical capital will help to improve or raise that long run aggregate supply. It's going to increase it, right? So it'd be a shift to the right on the graph. All right, so that all kind of shows you why the government did what it did, how that monetary policy from the Federal Reserve impacted that recessionary gap and helped to close it and prevent it from going even further south, right? It really kind of saved that aggregate demand from really plummeting down to the left there and having a lot of deflation, a big decrease in real GDP, right? By the Federal Reserve taking that more open approach to monetary policy and increasing that aggregate demand, it kind of helped us stay closer to our full employment, even though we're still far from it. It helped us from going even further into a recession, right? And then the fiscal policy side, we had the United States government instituting stimulus checks, which would boost that aggregate demand by increasing that disposable income and increasing consumer spending and investment spending. So that would also help shift that aggregate demand back to this level of full employment right here, right? To help eliminate some of that unemployment and improve that real GDP. So thanks for watching and have a great day.